Story 1. The Hospital on Ridgeway Hill. Locals told stories of patients screaming to the walls at night, of unmarked graves on the property, and of a doctor who disappeared without a trace in 1968 that only made Alex's friends more eager to check it out. They arrived around 4 p.m. in early autumn. The sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows across the cracked parking lot. The main entrance was sealed with rusted metal gates. But after a quick search, they found a side window on the first floor that had already been broken. They slipped inside. The air was thick with mold, dust, and something else, something metallic and sour. The walls were peeling, and rust-stained gurneys were still sitting in the halls like the patients had just vanished. They started filming right away, using headlamps and a GoPro to navigate the dim corridors at first. It was everything they expected. Long hallways filled with graffiti, collapsing ceilings, and abandoned patient rooms with rusty bed frames. They even found old records in one of the nurses' stations, handwritten notes with patient names, diagnoses, and treatments that would now be considered medieval. Electroshock therapy, ice baths, isolation chambers. Then they came across the basement stairs. This was where things started to get strange. The air was colder, much colder once they descended. Their breath misted in front of them, even though it was a mild autumn day outside. They joked nervously that it felt like a walk-in freezer. The basement was different. The graffiti stopped. There were no signs that anyone else had ever been down there. They walked past storage rooms full of rusted medical equipment, surgical tools, stretchers, even blood-stained smocks. One room had a wall lined with small metal doors. At first, they thought it was a freezer for medical samples, but then Mark opened one and realized it was a body drawer. A morgue. That's when the lights started to flicker. Only for a second. They thought it was their flashlights or low batteries, but everything was fully charged. They pressed on, now more curious and scared. They reached a locked door at the very end of the hallway. It was metal and heavy, painted black with a small observation window, like you'd see in a solitary confinement cell. There were deep scratches gouged into the paint, some even in the metal beneath. No one said it, but all three were thinking the same thing. Something to try to claw its way out. That's when the sound started, a faint tapping. They all stopped. It was rhythmic, steady, tap, tap, tap. They assumed it was an animal or dripping water, but the sound was coming from behind the door. Mark leaned close and whispered something sarcastic about ghosts. Then the tapping stopped. Silence. And then, bang, the door shook so violently they all jumped back. It was like something had slammed into it from the other side with all its weight. They ran. They didn't even look back. They barreled through the dark hallway, up the basement stairs, tripping over debris and rusted equipment. When they reached the main floor, something had changed. The air felt charged, like static before a lightning strike. The lights in the hallway flickered again, even though there was no power in the building. They heard footsteps on the floor above them. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, as if someone or something was walking directly over them. They stopped, held their breath, and listened. The steps moved down the hall, then stopped right above the stairwell. Without saying a word, they made for the exit. They scrambled out the broken window and didn't stop running until they reached their car. Only once they were back on the road did they start to process what had happened. Later that night, Alex reviewed the footage. Most of it was what they remembered. Spooky halls, weird shadows, and some creepy medical equipment. But in the basement footage, right after the door banged, there was something else that a voice that IT was faint, almost inaudible, but when he boosted the audio, he could make it out. A woman's voice, hoarse and broken, whispering just one word. Help! They never went back. Alex ended up pulling the video from their channel a week after posting it. He said the comments were freaking him out. People claiming they saw faces in the dark corners of the basement or eyes peering from the morgue drawers. Some said they heard more voices, some pleading, some screaming. Jesse quit Urbex altogether after that night. Mark said he was having nightmares for weeks. Alex kept exploring, but he said he never went back to a hospital or asylum again. Till this day, Ridgeway Asylum still stands. Empty, decaying, and very, very wrong. There's an old, crumbling hospital tucked away in the hills of western Pennsylvania. Locals call it Ridgeway Asylum. It was built in the early 1900s and served as a psychiatric hospital until the early 1970s, when it was abruptly shut down following a string of mysterious deaths, lawsuits, and budget cuts. Since then, it sat abandoned, overgrown by vines and trees, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Most people steer clear of it. But for urban explorers, it's a gold mine of decaying architecture and disturbing history. This story comes from Alex and his two friends, Jesse and Mark, who were seasoned urban explorers with a small YouTube channel that documented their adventures. They had done factories, schools, even a few forgotten mansions. But Ridgeway Asylum was something else. It had a reputation. Story 2, The House in the Pines. This story comes from a solo explorer named Maya, a photographer who specialized in forgotten places. Her Instagram was filled with hauntingly beautiful shots, decaying staircases, crumbling churches, empty theaters overtaken by vines. She preferred to explore alone, saying it gave her a deeper connection to the spaces she visited. One weekend in late October, she set her sights on a place that wasn't well documented. A follower had messaged her about a house deep in the woods of northern Vermont. No address, just GPS coordinates and a vague warning. Be careful. That house is different. Curious and intrigued, Maya planned the trip. The drive took her through small, sleepy towns and winding back roads. Eventually, she reached a dirt path that was almost completely hidden by pine trees. Her car could only go so far, so she hiked the rest, about a mile through dense forest until she found it. The house was massive, old colonial style with rotting clapboard siding and boarded up windows. It looked like it hadn't been touched in 50 years. There was no sign of other explorers, no graffiti, no broken doors, nothing. Just silence and the distant rustle of wind through trees. She stepped inside. The floorboards groaned under her weight. The air was stale and thick, and it smelled like mold and something else, like damp soil and rusted metal. The first floor was surprisingly intact. Furniture covered in sheets. Framed photos still on the walls. It was like whoever lived here had left suddenly, but not recently. She started taking pictures. A hallway mirror covered in dust. An antique clock frozen at 4:17. An old piano with keys yellow from age. Everything was frozen in time. But the longer she stayed, the more she noticed that something felt off. She found a photo album on a coffee table, filled with black and white pictures. Family portraits, mostly. But in every picture, one of the people had their face scratched out. Not blurred, not faded, violently scratched out with something sharp. She chalked it up to something personal, maybe a bitter relative or a dark history, and moved on. The second floor was darker. Every window was sealed tight. The hallway was long, with several doors, most slightly ajar. She opened each one slowly. The bedrooms were dust-covered time capsules. A child's room with toys neatly arranged. A master bedroom with clothes still in the closet. One room, though it was different, it was completely empty, except for the walls. They were covered in words. The same phrase, over and over, scrawled in what looked like black marker. Don't let it in. Over and over. Hundreds of times. The same handwriting, different sizes. Some were frantic, slanted, scratched so hard into the plaster that it left grooves. Maya felt the first real pang of unease then. Her breath came faster. She snapped a few pictures and left the room. In the hallway, she heard something move behind her. She spun around, but no one was there. Just the hallway, empty and still. She brushed it off. An animal in the attic, maybe. Old houses make noise. But as she reached the stairs, she saw something that made her stop cold. The mirror downstairs, the one by the hallway, was no longer covered in dust. She hadn't touched it, hadn't gone near it, but now it was completely clean. And in its reflection, she could see something standing at the end of the hall behind her. Tall, thin, shadow-like. She turned. Nothing. Just the empty hallway again. She didn't wait to investigate. She grabbed her camera and hurried downstairs. Every instinct told her to get out. But when she reached the front door, it was closed. She hadn't closed it. And when she tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was stuck, like it had swollen shut or been locked from the outside. She moved to the windows. all boarded. She hadn't noticed it before, but now she could see that the nails weren't just placed. They were bent inward, like the boards had been nailed shut from the inside. Panic set in. She started pacing, trying to find another exit. That's when she heard it. Footsteps upstairs. Slow, heavy, deliberate. She froze, heart pounding. There was no one else supposed to be here. She backed into the kitchen, grabbed the heaviest object she could find, a rusted cast iron pan, and waited. The footsteps stopped, and then she heard something worse. Breathing. Close. Just behind the doorframe. But when she lunged forward, swinging the pan into the hallway, there was nothing. No one. Just silence. She didn't know how, but she had to get out. She went to the basement door. It looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. The knob crumbled in her hand, but she managed to pry it open and descend into darkness. The basement was cold and damp. The smell of earth and mildew was overwhelming. Her flashlight caught glimpses of shelves, old jars filled with unidentifiable substances, and a dirt floor with something that looked like claw marks. In one corner, she found a small wooden door, half rotted and barely hanging on its hinges. Behind it was a tunnel, narrow, earthen, just tall enough to crouch through. It looked like it had been dug by hand. She had no other choice. Crawling through that tunnel felt endless. She could barely breathe. The air grew colder with each foot forward, and behind her, she swore she could hear shuffling. Something following. Something just out of reach. When she finally emerged, it was behind the house, near an old well hidden by brush. She sprinted back to her car, not even looking back. When she finally reached it, she locked the doors, turned the ignition, and peeled out of there like her life depended on it. She never posted those photos. Not a single one. She said they looked different when she got home, distorted, like something had tampered with the files. In some of them, she said she could see a figure in the corners, always just at the edge of the frame. Sometimes it looked like it was staring at her. She deleted everything. The house, as far as she knows, is still there, still hidden in the pines, still nailed shut from the inside. And she's never gone urbexing alone again.